Okay, we're ready to go. Thank you, and welcome back to part 2 of our series today.
Did you bring in the sign-in sheet from the other meeting? Oh, you should me, or Daniel.
Organizations.
Okay, thanks.
Ready to start?
Yes.
Introduce yourself and we can get going.
On behalf of the New York Apartment Association and our members, thank you for the invitation.
Mic on?
It's not, I don't think it's on.
You gotta push the little red button at the bottom.
No, it's that one, yeah.
Oh, it's that one, okay.
On behalf of the New York Apartment Association and our members, thank you for the invitation to appear before you this afternoon. My name is Kelly Farrell, and I am joined by Joe Condon, and we will be providing testimony on the ongoing operational challenges that pre-1974 highly stabilized buildings and affordable housing providers are operating under, given the fiscal reality of declining NOI. We recognize that the board has been put into a very difficult position in this post-2019 HSTP era to be the only defenders of rent-stabilized housing, but that is the challenge you face. The board heard testimony earlier this month about the increasing distress experienced by a significant number of rent-stabilized buildings. This is the housing stock we must preserve. RGB data clearly demonstrates the incredible financial constraints that certain stabilized market sectors are operating under, and we recognize that there are outside pressures on you to discount this data. We know that rent increases are hard for many to bear, but revenue needs to keep pace with expenses and cover the costs that are necessary to keep running and ensure quality housing for all New Yorkers. It is your data that indicates the appropriate adjustments this year are 6.25% for a one-year lease and 9.75% for a two-year lease. The CPI-adjusted NOI commensurate adjustment. This adjustment only attempts to stem further distress and hold the line to keep the current level of distress. It does not resolve any problems nor move things forward. These are the increases needed just to keep the situation constant, to keep further distress at bay, nothing more. I will now turn it over to Joe, who will delve into more specifics on the scope and depth of the economic distress that the pre-1974 highly regulated stock has experienced.
Thank you, Kelly. Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's good to see you all again. Congratulations to the new members. Congratulations on your appointment. Doug, congratulations on your appointment to the chair. You will have a lot of work to do, and unfortunately that work is what we're going to be highlighting for you today. So what you'll hear Kelly and I talk about are the significant levels of distress in the stabilized universe, the continued barrage of additional unfunded mandates from the City Council, reduced spending by housing providers on maintenance and capital improvements, and how this combination of factors puts the homes of many New Yorkers at risk. As dire as the circumstances are, unfortunately, since the 2019 HSTPA, it's not that surprising since it removed any way to improve building income for the highly stabilized properties other than guideline adjustments from this board. And since 2019 and for even longer, since about 2017, this board's guidelines have fallen well below the minimum to keep up with inflation and other increases in operating costs as well. Our testimony will focus on the pre-1974 highly stabilized buildings, which we consider to be 80% or more stabilized in the building and outside the core of Manhattan. This category of buildings comprises more than 8,000 buildings throughout the city and 343,000 apartments. It makes up nearly half of all rent-stabilized units citywide, pre or post 74. 61% of all stabilized units outside the core of Manhattan, pre or post, and 70% of all pre-1974 units outside the core of Manhattan. So it's a large majority of the stock. And to highlight it further, this pre-1974 highly stabilized stock is largely concentrated in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. Before I get started, I do want to just commend this board and the staff for producing more of its data in a targeted fashion, in particular breaking out the pre-1974 from the post-1973 buildings and further breaking them down by percentage of rent-stabilized apartments in the building. We believe that this particular category of housing stock represents the affordable housing that is most reliant on this board's guideline to keep up with the operating costs and keep New Yorkers in quality housing. So we think it would also be beneficial to this board's deliberations to use that categorical breakdown of construction data and percent stabilized in all the reports that you produce. To the data. So our first point here is, as you may have guessed, we believe that this board must focus its guideline deliberations on addressing the economic realities of the pre-1974 housing stock that contain high portions of rent-stabilized apartments. This stock has been defunded and continues to fall into further distress. If you look at the chart on the screen, you also have it in front of you. It should be the first chart in the package I gave you. We are focusing again on the pre-1974 stock here. We see that citywide, excluding core Manhattan, this focuses just on 100% stabilized buildings, this chart, and they have seen their average NOI drop per unit 13% since 2019 in nominal dollars, and if we adjust for inflation, that's a 27% drop in NOI. And if you look at the chart, the percent changes since 2019 are the second to bottom row of the chart, and if we adjust for inflation, that's the very last row of the chart. And if you look at the graph, you can see that bottom line is the Bronx there. That's and the one above it is citywide. You can see that where it starts and where it ends, there's a pretty consistent downward trend there. And again, this is not. Let's go through it. So. These numbers are taken directly from the I&E reports and memos that are produced by this board over the last several years. So there's no magic in where we created this data or where we got this data from. We're just putting it out there so you can see the economic reality for this pre-1974 100% stabilized stock of buildings. And it's not a small portion. It's not a small portion of the housing stock at all. In the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, pre-1974 100% stabilized buildings, or the stock there is comprised of 3,500 buildings containing 155,000 homes for New Yorkers. And if we just look in the Bronx alone, this category of buildings comprises 75% of all buildings in the Bronx. And citywide, it's more than 300,000 rental units. And these trends that you see on the chart and in the graph are simply not sustainable for housing providers to be able to keep hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers housed in high-quality housing. How do we get here? As I mentioned before, since 2017, the annual guidelines adopted by this board have fallen short of the minimum adjustment necessary to keep pace with inflation and other rising costs. If you flip to the next chart in your package, that will describe what I'm talking about now. And while it was common practice for this board not to adopt guidelines that are 100% keeping up with inflation, in 2019, everything changed. The HSTPA made numerous changes to the rent-stabilized laws restricting how rents could be adjusted between tenancies. Prior to 2019, there were vacancy rent adjustments that could be used to offset the below CPI lease renewal guidelines that were adopted by the board. However, because these vacancy adjustments are no longer permitted since 2019, the RGB guidelines have a much more significant impact on the economic health of these buildings. And as we see from the chart, what we did is there's two charts up there. The one on the left, we tracked the average rent for a Bronx apartment from 2013 to 2024. The column in the middle, it's entitled 1 Year Guideline, that adjusts that 2013 rent by the 1 year guideline every year. And in 2024, it comes out to a rent of $1,021.26. And in the next column over, we adjusted that average rent from 2013 by the CPI adjusted commensurate. And going through the years, when you get to 2024, that average rent should be $1,178 if we were keeping up with CPI. And what that shows you is that the the average rent for a Bronx apartment in 2024 is $157 below where it should be to account for inflation. So that's 15% below where it should be. And that you can see here. So this is a chart of the Bronx rent growth, and you can see the longer it goes, the larger that gap gets, and the size of that gap depends on the difference between what the CPI adjusted inflation commensurate was and what the one-year guideline was. And this chart shows you the CPI adjusted commensurate and the one-year guideline. The orange line is the CPI adjusted commensurate. The blue line is the one-year guideline. And as you can see, since 2017, the one-year guideline is always below that orange line. So it's always below the CPI. And some years the gap is larger, some years it's not, but there's always a gap, and that's why NOI is down, as we showed, and that's why the average Bronx apartment is 15% below where it should be since 2013 to cover those costs. And the reason we think it's important for the board to focus its deliberations on the highly stabilized buildings is because they don't have the ability, certainly for the 100% stabilized, they have no ability to cross-subsidize the shortfalls with other free market units. And even for the for 80% highly stabilized, maybe not 100% stabilized, areas outside of core Manhattan don't have a free market rent that is high enough for a few deregulated units to be able to cross-subsidize all of the rent-stabilized units and the shortfalls in the rent increases that you see on the board. So as NOI drops in this segment of the housing stock, housing providers have to start to begin making difficult choices about how they spend money, about their expenses. Unfortunately, most of the costs for these buildings are either fixed by the government, water and sewer, property taxes, utilities, or they're non-negotiable requirements, for example, property insurance. And therefore, there's very little room for flexibility in the budget of where to spend the money. One of the few levers that property owners do have is the maintenance and repair category, as well as capital expenses. Your numbers have shown that spending in the maintenance repair category in inflation-adjusted dollars has decreased by 10.5% for pre-1974 buildings outside the core Manhattan from 2019 to 2023. In 2019, in inflation-adjusted numbers, the average spend on repair and maintenance was $210 per unit. In 2023, that is now $188 per unit in inflation-adjusted dollars. So this results in deferred maintenance, and if NOI does not start improving, physical deterioration of the buildings starts to occur. The trend of declining NOI also leads to fewer capital projects that we've seen in the MCI numbers and less investment in housing quality for New Yorkers. It's also leading to increasing numbers of distressed properties, increasing mortgage defaults, foreclosures, bank collapses, SEC scrutiny of the loan books for the remaining New York City community banks that still lend to this asset class. So it's causing a lot of trouble. And the longer this board waits to improve the fiscal outlook for these buildings, the harder it will be to do so. And at some point, I don't know when that is, but there will be a point of no return for these buildings, and eventually the bank or the city becomes the owner here. So the distress. So the effect of the NOI decline can clearly be seen in the significant increase in distressed properties since 2019. While the mortgage survey report focuses on a 0.5% decrease in distressed buildings from 2022 to 2023, that was driven largely by the core of Manhattan, it fails to note that every other borough saw an increase in pre-1974 distressed properties. We think it's very important to highlight that fact for this board. It seems to be an omission from the report. And aside from the year-to-year increase everywhere but the core of Manhattan in distressed properties, the number of pre-1974 distressed buildings, as reported by the RGB, remains significantly above the 2019 distress numbers. And you can see from the chart in the Bronx, 2019, 158 distressed properties, 2023, 455 distressed properties for a 188% increase in distress. Upper Manhattan, 192 distressed properties in 2019, 326 distressed properties in 2023. That's a 70% increase. Brooklyn, 118 to 279. Queens, 67 to 140. So there's and sort of what I mentioned before, I think it's important to even break out this distressed buildings by the pre-post 7094 and also the stabilized percentages. But as you can see, the pre-1974 outside core of Manhattan still experiencing significant amounts of distress with no relief in sight. So of the 1,481 pre-1974 buildings that were reported as distressed citywide from this board, 1,200 of them are in buildings outside the core of Manhattan. That means of all the distress, 80% of it is outside the core of Manhattan. This segment of the housing stock is clearly in jeopardy. It comprises, like I said, 80% of the buildings outside, 10% of all pre-1974 stock, and was even more telling from the distress numbers that this board reports is that the post-73 stock has basically maintained the same level of distress. There does not appear to be an increase in distress from that building stock. In 2019, there were 73 buildings. They were post-46 at that point. They were still not the post-74. But so there were 73 in 2019, and then in 2023, 71 buildings. That's maybe the decline but clearly the changes to HSTPA and these less than CPI adjustments do not impact the newer housing stock, the post-73 housing stock, as significant and as negatively as they are impacting the pre-74 housing stock. Now, these numbers look pretty bad for the pre-74 stabilized housing stock, but we believe things are even worse because we believe the RGB underestimates the number of distressed buildings because it fails to account for two major expense components from buildings, and that is debt service and capital expenses. So the NOI numbers I showed you before, you all know this, they don't include debt service, they don't include capital expenses. And so that's actually, and neither does this distress numbers. So that's just basically with on operating and maintenance. Is your income able to cover your operating and maintenance? Doesn't count debt service. So those numbers are very likely lower than the actual level of distress out there. And let me go to the next chart. So here, this chart models how debt service coverage ratios that were healthy in 2019 for a 100% stabilized pre-74 building in the Bronx have now become distress loans due to the declining NOI at these buildings. On the chart, this chart is also, it should be the next one in your package, but the blue line represents a 1.0 debt service coverage, which is just breaking even on your debt service. Your NOI covers your debt service and nothing more. And as you can see, some of the buildings that started with healthy debt service coverage, 1.3 in 2019, are now below that 1.0 debt service coverage break-even line. So again, we started,
Joe,
yes.
do you mind if I just ask?
Go ahead.
This? It's hard to read everything, but how you actually determined the debt service ratio for these buildings, because as you pointed out, NOI doesn't include debt service.
So, yes.
And we don't know the underlying debt on this stock.
Absolutely. So
How
this
did
is
you do that?
This is just a model. So what we did was, we looked at the NOI in 2019. We took we took a 1.3 debt service coverage from that number. So in 2019, for a Bronx pre-74 building, it was $275 at 1.3, based on the NOI that building was producing in 2019.
So the amount of debt that building would support would be,
Well, it's just a model. So if
Right.
we took 1.3, you could take 1.4 and see where it goes.
no, I'm just
yeah.
I'm just trying to understand your logic. In the
Yes, so the idea was to take something conservative, a conservative debt service for that year, and I think 1.3 is conservative. I think there has been testimony from bankers and also from, I think, tenant advocates that is a reasonable conservative debt service number. So these buildings in 2019, we didn't want to take something that was over leveraged or speculative or whatever. So we took a conservative number. We applied that to the NOI in 2019, and then that's the number that they have to pay every year after. So the $275 in debt service,
Got it.
they have to pay that again in 2020. They have to pay that in 2021, 22. And then, so then we use that $275 to determine what the debt service coverage is in the next year and then the year after that. And as you can see from the chart, it's also in the paper I gave you if you have trouble seeing on the screen. In 2019, it was 1.3 for a Bronx pre-74 100% stabilized buildings. In 2020, that went to 1.25. 2021, not so bad, slight drop, 1.24. 2022. Now you're at 1.0. 2023, they're now at 0.99. So
Sorry, just another clarification on this. So the two columns have the same label. They both say Bronx pre-74 DSCR. Is one of them
correct.
referring to something else?
So the second column, we used a 1.2 debt service to show
see just a difference.
to show if you were in that position, you're in even a worse position now.
Sure.
And then the third column is Upper Manhattan. We did it for Upper Manhattan too. Same methodology. Took the 2019 number, got the debt service at 1.3. Upper Manhattan's doing a little better. They're now at in 2023, they were at 1.07, but that's 2 years ago. We're pretty sure that the NOI in these buildings has continued to decline. Kelly will talk about that a little bit more as far as unfunded mandates and other things that have occurred in the last 2 years. So that's just 2023, but you can see where the trend is going. And like I said, we think that's largely because there is no other avenue for these buildings to increase operating revenue other than this board's guideline. And since 2019, and even a couple of years before that, this board's guideline has not been sufficient to keep up. And that was in the prior chart. And I put on the end there, so just to help flavor this a little. So the change in NOI from those years. So when the for the Bronx building, that first column, when it went to 1.24 in 2021 to 1.0 in 2022, the year-to-year change in NOI there was 19%, a 19% drop. So clearly the NOI has an effect on this, and clearly there is an underreporting of distress. I don't want to call it an underreporting, but there are more distressed buildings than this board reports because it does not use debt service to attempt to get the full building expense profile. And then if you want to figure out, well, where do capital reserves come from? Well, there's nothing left. There's nothing left for any type of capital expenditure for these Bronx pre-74 buildings. So like I said, in order to get an accurate picture of the expense profile for rent-stabilized buildings, we believe this board must recognize that debt service is a normal operating expense for most pre-1974 rent-stabilized buildings with 11 or more units, according to the mortgage survey report, or the data. Looking only at buildings of 11 units or more, 73% of buildings surveyed had debt service. 73%. The fact that 73% of buildings with 11 units or more have debt service should encourage this board to treat it as a normal operating expense and include it some way to get a fuller, more accurate expense profile of these buildings. And it appears that the RGB is slightly unique here in its decision not to have some sort of debt service coverage number, because most if not all, other rate-making bodies in New York City appear to account for debt service and capital expenditures as part of their rate-making process. New York City Water Board, they take into account both debt service and capital expenditures of the Department of Environmental Protection when they are setting water and sewer rates. The New York State Public Service Commission does the same for Con Ed and National Grid when they're setting their rates. These are official boards that are setting rates across the city, and they're using debt service and capital expenditures. And we think this board should also take into account some form of debt service because that's the only way you're going to account for the realities of what multifamily housing operations and budgets look like. So what is this board supposed to do? We're showing you the distress. Things are trending downward. There's more distress out there than even is being reported. It's a very difficult position for this board to be in. We think returning NOI to adequate levels in the pre-1974 housing stock to ensure daily maintenance and repairs, to ensure debt service can be covered, to avoid loan defaults, to allow for capital planning for capital projects. That should be the goal of this board. NOI has to be at adequate levels for these especially these pre-1974 highly stabilized buildings to be able to operate, to be able to provide the quality housing that New Yorkers have come to expect from them. And arguably, that's the legislative mandate of this board, to preserve the rent-stabilized housing stock. So at a minimum, the board should be looking at a guideline to prevent further distress and disinvestment in this housing stock. Stop this trend. And we believe that at a minimum, the CPI adjusted commensurate would do that. It would maintain the current levels of distress in the pre-74 highly stabilized stock. It would not improve them, but it would maintain them. It would hopefully prevent further distress from occurring. If this board were inclined to start looking at restoring the NOI at some of these buildings, especially the pre-74 highly stabilized buildings, it would look to adopt a guideline that is slightly higher than the CPI adjusted commensurate. But make no mistake here, adopting a guideline below the CPI adjusted commensurate is a statement from this board that the distress and disinvestment in these properties, the trends that you have seen on these charts, will continue and will put hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers' homes at risk. And now I will turn it over to Kelly to talk about the additional government mandates that we believe will continue to drive NOI down without adequate rent increases.
Kyle, each year we provide you a list with mandates. So we included some new ones this year. They're listed. I'm not going to go through them. But I want to highlight what these mandates mean, because this year happens to be a particularly harsh year for stabilized properties to meet the mandates, because right now they have gas detectors due by May 1st. XRF testing before August 9th, common area XRF testing August 9th. There's been new trash bins, new recycling rules, new composting, and local 197 prescriptive measures. So when you look at that for a 40-unit building, it's estimated that these costs would be approximately $36,000 just to comply with the mandates that we're seeing for about this 9-month period. And so that's the significance of what these mandates mean for these buildings. And we know that there's an important consideration in all of this, and that's to balance the fiscal realities for the housing providers and for renters. But it's worth noting, there are more than 175,000 rent-stabilized households that are in some sort of rent subsidy program right now. Section 8 housing choice vouchers, city vets vouchers cover over 100,000 people, about 104 stabilized households. And those tenants just pay any rent that's above 1/3 their income. So the vouchers will cover any rent increase given by this board. Screen and Dream programs cover in addition just about 72,000 people. And again, those rents are frozen, so no increase is paid by those households as well. So the households that the board is most concerned with from an affordability perspective are protected from any rent increases right now. As we close out today, we want to thank the board and the professional staff for their insights in collecting and analyzing data concerning the economics of New York City's regulated apartment buildings and their tenancies. Housing in New York is expensive. The New York Apartment Association is striving to find ways to make this a more affordable proposition for both owners and tenants alike. We continue to work with government partners to urge them to reduce taxes, water, sewer, and other costs within its control. We support initiatives that shield increases from those least able to pay them, such as Screen Tree and the various voucher programs. And we are working with advocates throughout the state on programs such as the Housing Voucher Access Program to expand housing affordability. But we are here testifying before the RGB today because you were challenged to establish the appropriate rental adjustments needed by stabilized buildings in New York City, given the fiscal realities of declining NOI and the corresponding stresses this is placing on ongoing building operations and housing quality, particularly in pre-1974 highly stabilized stock. And the reality is the adjustment necessary to do this is the CPI-adjusted NOI commensurate adjustment. We urge you to adopt this standard.
Thank you. I'm sure there are questions. I'll look around the room. Alex?
Thank you very much. I have a couple questions. One is, do you have any insight as to the degree to which the decrease in NOI is driven by operating costs increasing higher than expected as opposed to rental collections falling short?
I'll just clarify that the last person who spoke mentioned that he believed that the reason these buildings might be in distress is that rent collections are down. I sort of held back in saying that, like, the subsidy family is very robust right now. You know, Rob and I are in court every day, and we see that one-shot deals and housing vouchers. So I sort of disagreed with Tim, who spoke and said that he believes that it's because rent collections are down versus you can say what the increase is in insurance year over year. But I would say it's more tied to, as Alex's question, more tied to the expenses rather than difficulty in collecting rents.
So I'll just go back to this chart, which in my opinion shows why NOI is down. You have the one-year guideline compared to the CPI adjusted commensurate, and it's lower. The guideline is lower than the commensurate every time.
Yeah, but that doesn't reflect actual rent collections, just the maximum allowable rent.
That's correct, but and I would also say, I mean, I believe rent collections were down certain years, but I believe they have come back to respectable levels in the most recent years. I mean, we're talking COVID. This is more like a COVID era issue than anything we're seeing now.
So if I may, I have two other questions. So one is, why do you use the one-year guideline as a basis as opposed to a composite, which that Timothy used in the last presentation, where you're combining 1- and 2-year increases and vacancy allowances when they're allowed? So this is the more extreme case when you're just looking at the 1-year guideline. And we know that roughly half of renters take 2-year leases. So that seems to me is somewhat more stark.
Happy to recreate this with the 2-year guideline, but there are no more vacancy increases.
Yeah, I know that, but prior to 2019 there were.
Right,
Between
but this
2013 and 2018.
This is so. That's fair. The adjustments in those years, the CPI adjustments are in when there was a vacancy increase, those were adjusted to take into account for that. So this board used to issue a CPI adjusted with vacancy and without vacancy. So the CPI adjusted we uses were with vacancy, so they do account for that.
And my final question, which is actually separate from this, do you have information on the cap rates that investors use year to year for purchasing rent-stabilized housing?
It's something we can get back to you with. Anecdotally, cap rates are very high right now. I believe they're 6.5, 7.
It'd be interesting to know over the last 5 years how they've changed. If you have that would be great.
It's something we can look into.
Thank you.
I mean, it's generally a relationship between interest rates and NOI. So there's no perfect, because
No, I know.
that period of time, obviously, a huge change in interest rates. Yeah. Yeah, it's, Genesis, you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to just clarify something about people getting assistance. Yeah, it was mentioned that 665 rent-stabilized households are protected from paying any rent increases due to the screen entry program, and that therefore we should not worry about them because they're protected already. I think, it's kind of a false statement. As of DOF, DOF claims that there are almost 74,000 people who are not enrolled in the program. So and again, that's just based on the number of apartments that were registered. As we know, there's a bunch of rent-stabilized apartments that have not been registered yet after 2021. So there's a lot of people who have not been covered. And then the Section 8 program only covers about 1/4 of the eligible tenants. So the majority of the tenants who are rent-stabilized are not covered by any subsidy. Also, all of these subsidies, even though the tenants are not paying the rent increases, the landlords are getting the rent increases. Like the screen entry program, the landlords are getting the rent increases via tax credit. So you're getting the money back. So it's not like people are not paying rent. The city's paying the rent, and the state is paying the rent for the tenants.
Right, that's the whole point. The increase can be allowed to keep NOI or bring NOI back to where it is without the actual rent increase having to be paid by the tenant. So it's a way to bring some fiscal health back to these buildings without these low-income tenants seeing the rent increase.
I get it. But again, the majority are not covered by the program.
We would love to have a SCREE or DREE sign-up program and try to get those 70,000 unapplied but eligible households on.
Yeah, there's a bill right now, 2 bills right now, one by Senator Claire Kavanaugh stating to require landlords to send the notices to eligible tenants. But I don't think your organization has supported that bill. It would be nice if you did.
It sounds great.
I'll hold you accountable.
Joe, I want to ask, you used a metric that I don't think I had heard before, that 73% of buildings, I think you meant the 100%, I guess, have debt service? Mm-hmm. Where did that data come from? You said
So
it came
it's from the mortgage survey data.
Oh,
I looked at so it has a breakdown in there of or maybe this was from the memo last year. There was a mortgage survey memo on a breakdown of
was like 2 years ago.
where the percentage of buildings based on building size, whether they had debt service.
It was last year, right?
And it was something where it was like 50-50 if you include all the buildings that are under 11 units. But once you strip those out, you get that. And let's not forget that those smaller buildings are not anywhere here in the NOI, in the expense data. They do not file RPIEs. They are not in here.
Right.
So to have them put in the mortgage survey, if it's,
Yeah, no, I understand
it's
what you're
helpful,
saying,
but
conceptually.
if you're looking at the NOI for the buildings that have 11 or more units, you should be looking at the debt service for the buildings that have 11 or more units.
But let's just go with that for 1 second. It doesn't really speak to the extent of the debt on that building, right? It just says there is some debt.
Absolutely, and that's probably a harder number to get to. But that's why we try to use a conservative debt service number here, and you can play with it as much as you want. But clearly there are more buildings in distress than reported because some of those buildings were at 1.3 in 2019, and now they're 0.99, 0.91, wherever, well below the 1.0.
yeah, thanks so much for the testimony. So I wanted to follow up a little bit on the capital expenses, because I think on the mortgage side, we did have our own survey that we had done to try to capture, mortgage frequency, and then we hear updates from the, from the CBC, which has their own versions of debt service coverage ratios, at least on their book. But I do think that the capital expenses are a little bit of a black box as far as we're concerned, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that our expense categories, pertain to these types of recurring or non-recurring CapEx items. So I was just trying to get a sense from you of how to benchmark the size and scope of these expenses. For every dollar of revenue, like how much would you say is like CapEx? And then just as a quick follow-up on that, in terms of like accounting measures that would deal with this, among REITs, it's common to report something like AFFO, right? Adjusted funds from operations, right? Which doesn't include depreciation, which is also not included in our expense item, but does include mortgage servicing costs and does include CapEx, the year in which it's incurred. So that's like a standard reporting and accounting item for publicly traded REITs. So I don't know if that's some item that you all would track, or you would be, is there a way to create a metric that does incorporate the CapEx and the financing costs?
So thank you for the question. I forgot the first part.
How much are CapEx?
Oh, yeah, that's it. So it's not perfect, but if you look at the DHCR reasonable cost schedule for major capital improvements, that will give you a reasonable idea and probably a conservative idea of what the prices for these CapEx items are. And then you can look at the useful life schedule in the DHCR, the MCI useful life schedule, and use those years, I guess, as a proxy for how often this will happen, or how much % per year you should be reserving as far as CapEx to make that improvement when it's necessary. So and something we can work on. That's where I would go to start putting together some sort of model. And like I said, I think it's probably not 100% of what the costs actually are, but it's a reasonable estimate.
So I just want to ask, so let's just take this picture. We agree or disagree. What are owners doing to continue to manage their properties in the context of declining NOIs? I mean, I just want to get your, this is data, and that's helpful. We obviously have heard data from the tenants that's equally as helpful and important to see. I'm trying to get a better feeling for what's really happening. I mean, where are you seeing the distress? What is that looking like? Are you seeing large-scale foreclosures? I mean, we read the papers. We've seen anecdotal evidence. I think I saw, was it yesterday, that Related sold off buildings at like $9,000 a unit. That felt like a tax loss sale. I don't think that's real. So I'm just trying to get a better sense of what's really you're seeing among your membership in this regard.
There's a lot of struggle, and there is a lot of distress.
But how is that manifesting itself? Is it deferred maintenance? So I should see higher rates of violations? Is it more vacate orders from HPD because buildings are not habitable? Like how am I going to see that?
There's definitely deferred maintenance. It may not be resulting in violations. It has to be at a point before it will. But and I think more so the deferred capital investment and lack of capital investment. I think that's really the number one thing that gets cut off. And I think that's a huge issue. This is, like I said, pre-1974. This is a really old housing stock. Most of it is even older than 1974. And that's probably what I see people pulling back on the most.
You're not replacing the boiler, but patching the boiler.
Exactly. Roofs, boilers, elevators, all of that stuff is patchwork. And even if it's past the useful life, it doesn't, it's no longer an incentive there are no longer incentives to actually replace those items. And that's, I would say, is where we see it the most. Starting to see a little bit in deferred maintenance, not to the point, I think, where you are going to see huge violation increases yet. But this is the precursor, right? This is, first it's the CapEx, then it's the maintenance, and then it's the point of no return.
I just, this is not a question, but the examples you were using about entities that take into account CapEx and underlying debt in their calculation of increase, the water board and the public utility are actually public utilities, where they're capped in their...
Some of these housing providers feel like public utilities.
Yeah, but they're capped in their profits and they're capped in other ways that obviously this stock isn't. So just to point it out.
They are capped. They're very capped.
Did you?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I wanted to say that, like, when it comes to NOI, I do think that it is proper that debt service is calculated after that, because from a, like, from the perspective of equity, debt service is a cash cost, but in, like, the economic theory of it, the capital structure, like, the debt and equity are sharing the waterfall from the NOI. So it's like saying my debt service is expensive is like saying my dividends are expensive. You know what I mean? It's like, they're just two sides of the capital structure. But that doesn't mean that that debt distress is irrelevant, because it's a predictor of NOI distress. Right? So, like, before the building runs out of NOI, they lose their ability to pay any outstanding debt. So it's more of like, it's a canary in the coal mine of equity and debt are splitting losses until they're no longer able to service the debt. And so I was curious if you guys just, like, one thing that we were looking into is table 9 in the INE of the ratio of operating costs to income suggests, like, to your point about this distress being higher than the 10%, that the bottom 2 deciles in table 9, so the citywide has a cost to income ratio of 0.99. So it's not literally underwater on NOI, but that would mean that they have 1% of their gross income available to service debt. Is that where that's showing up? Like, is it more like 20% of the stock is close to underwater?
I think that was your, Arpit, you had the same question for Andrew, yeah.
We're still trying to figure out exactly what that table means, because, because that's on an NOI basis, right? That's set aside all debt service questions. On an NOI basis, so I don't know. It's where I'm interested in more, but.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this. So, like, that 90th percentile, it's 0.99, that would be the ceiling. So it's under that.
That's not the median.
That's not the median of that decile.
That's the ceiling of the debt. Each
Of that-
number
of
is the
each
ceiling of
decile.
each decile.
Yeah.
So what is the meaning of the top decile? Is that like the very peak of the distribution of all?
That's the most extreme outlier?
Yeah, that's the most extreme. So you see a number, I think, in one of those that's 2 points. That was the real extreme. But everything is going to be below that. But that's still arguable. Then you go to the next decile, which is 80, and what that is, and then you know it's from that point to that point of where we're at.
Decile reported that way.
Yeah, that's.
You got a bunch of statisticians in this group. You gotta keep you on your toes.
So just looking at that table, so for example, Bronx 90th percentile is 1.04. That would mean that 90% of buildings in the Bronx are under 1.04. Is that correct? Oh, it's all right. We could talk about this after.
Yeah.
I have one more question. Yeah.
Well, Andrew looks for that. Why don't you go, Alex? I know you have to run.
So earlier this morning, a couple people testified that they recognize that there is a significant but discrete amount of distressed housing. And they referred to a number of programs that aim to address some of these issues. Some new programs, some old ones like J51. And I'm curious how you would respond to that why can't the owners of these distressed properties take advantage of these programs? And to what extent would that help address this problem?
So,
Sure.
oh, all right, so I think someone else is going to talk about that. I will just flag that the J51 program is not even up and running yet. It was, I mean, part of the problem is it's retroactive. Mostly, I think it was passed by the state in 2022 or 2023. We're now in 2025, and it's not even up and running. So that should tell you all you need to know about the availability and the efficiency of these types of programs. And not to mention, if you want to look at the cost schedule for the J51, it is significantly well below any real costs. If you just compare it to the MCI cost schedule, you'll see it's significantly well. You would think that New York City prices would be higher than statewide prices, but for some reason HPD's cost schedule is well below. So even if it were available, it doesn't provide the necessary incentive.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you all.
I think,
Vacancy,
who's next? I'm not even sure. Basha, you? You're,
like, signing vacancy lease.
you guys can negotiate buying yourselves.
HPS reporting vacant for rent versus just vacant. So some of those are not even for rent. From HCR, it's not simply.
I have no
So
preference.
the HPS number is vacant for rent.
Brian Makers, he's the filmmaker. He wants it, so you get a good profile, I guess.
All right, that is on. Everyone can hear me?
Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, Chair Apple, board members, and RGB staff. My name is Basha Gerhard, Senior Vice President of Planning for the Real Estate Board of New York. REBNY is the city's leading real estate trade association, and an important part of the housing ecosystem we represent are the owners and managers of tens of thousands of rent-stabilized units. Thank you to the members of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board for the opportunity to provide our perspective regarding rent adjustments for the city's rent-regulated apartments as part of this year's 2025 proceedings. The only system-wide mechanism for aligning revenue with rising costs, covering basic apartment turnover expenses, and by extension, for preserving housing quality in stabilized apartments, falls to the responsibility of this board. Therefore, given the importance of the board's decision and to help the RGB make such a decision based on the most recent data available on the owner side, REBNY again commissioned a study led by HRNA advisors to analyze more current revenue and expense data and change over the last 5 years. Importantly, based on prior conversations with this board, staff, and the Furman Center, we appreciate the importance of especially gathering data on buildings for smaller buildings with less than 11 units, whose information is not available to the board from their current data pools from the Department of Finance. The TC201 study includes data for 2024 that was submitted to the City of New York in March 2025. It's attached as an appendix to my written submission. The study was conducted in April this year with outreach by REBNY and SPONY to the owners and managers of rent-stabilized housing. The study utilized 2,117 owner-provided TC201 tax forms from 2019 to 2024, representing over 790 buildings, to examine increases to owner expenses and the impact on income on a longitudinal basis. Of these buildings, importantly, we were able to get information on small buildings. 95 are small buildings with fewer than 20 units, and that includes 20 buildings of less than 11 units. This is the 4th year we have undertaken this exercise, and in the RGB staff reports last year and this year, our expense information from the prior years was affirmed. The latest TC201 data once again confirms that rising costs in insurance, fuel, and utilities are the primary drivers of overall expense growth. We also see a clear bifurcation in the fates of pre-1973 versus post-1974 buildings, and those within versus outside the Manhattan core. This bifurcation is most visible in the expense category of insurance. Monthly insurance costs continue to increase into 2024 and have risen 145% in pre-1973 buildings per unit since 2019. Buildings with less than 11 units had the highest increase in insurance costs, with a 229% increase. The increases in insurance reflect the risk in operating and maintaining rental housing in New York City, inclusive of unpaid rental arrears, cost of regulatory compliance, and financing and debt risk. Additionally, the data reveals a 3% decline in net operating income per unit for post-1974 buildings and a more pronounced 10% drop for pre-1973 buildings between 2023 and 2024. On the latter point, this continues a downward trend in NOI. The RGB reported out this year on our oldest and most vulnerable units. It was raised, how many are these we talking about? 4 out of 5 of our units are built prior to 1974 in the city. To keep buildings in good physical condition for the people who live in them, we encourage this board to take a holistic view in its 2025 guideline deliberations, one that considers rising operating expenses, the share of distressed properties, and localized financial pressures. While citywide NOI modestly increased between 2022 and 2023, according to the most recent RGB data, the same data reveals NOI declines in many areas outside core Manhattan. These neighborhood-level disparities highlight growing concerns about the long-term financial sustainability of stabilized housing across much of the city. We ask that core Manhattan NOI be viewed in context. Land and construction costs are significantly higher, and many buildings are newer, larger developments concentrated in areas that are allowed by zoning to be that size and are likely built under the 421A tax incentive program. These properties are more likely to have access to units with market rate rents than those rent-regulated properties outside of core Manhattan or those that are pre-1973. Manhattan core properties carry higher rents due to elevated development costs and tend to have higher labor costs as a requirement of the programs that built them. As a matter of practice, to remain competitive for those market rate rents, those buildings will have higher routine maintenance costs and employ more building service workers. At the same time, these newer buildings do not pay the same share of residential revenue and property taxes, but they do still pay taxes as older stabilized buildings. They also generate substantial one-time tax revenue from construction and financing, which further distinguishes them from the rest of the stabilized housing stock. The RGB's responsibility is to preserve the health of the entire stabilized housing system and not make decisions, we hope, based on just the Manhattan core data alone. Unfortunately for the city's fiscal health, declining NOI, which the RGB staff reports and the TC201 survey document, is occurring in many parts of the city, especially in the older housing stock, which represents the majority of the stabilized stock. This has significant implications for property tax revenue, as tax assessments and collections are based on rental income. The TC201 survey shows a 6% drop in NOI in pre-1973 rent-stabilized housing. From 2019 to 2023, the most recent year of data analyzed by the RGB, expenses for rent-stabilized owners have grown by 12.3%. Over the same period, RGB rent adjustments for one-year leases have only risen by 8.56%, and net operating income for owners rose by just 3.72%. To better support decision-making, we believe both DHCR and DOF should improve access to critical, already collected data by the agencies on rent-stabilized housing, including regular publication of building-level registration data with stabilization percentage by quartile and zip code-level data on vacancies and MCI-IAI activity. Improving transparency will help all stakeholders, including the RGB, assess the health of the stabilized housing stock using consistent and reliable data. In the interim, we hope the board will consider the points we raised today and the spirit in which this data is collected, which is to provide real-time information to the proceedings. We urge the board to adopt guidelines that reflect the financial realities facing stabilized housing today and ensure the long-term health of this critical segment of the city's housing stock. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide the 2025 TC201 survey and consider our testimony for this process. I know there was several questions already. I just want to tick off what I noted. One was about cap rates. Another one was on capital expenses. There was the J51 program. And feel free to add to that list, and happy to get started when the board is ready.
Ross, absorbing all your charts. I don't get too crazy. I will start, and I think it's, maybe there's a reason, but there's a fair, oh, sorry. I'm looking at your chart, that's the average monthly income per unit by category.
you have income down, when you say, I assume when you say rent regulated, those were rent stabilized units as opposed to the unstabilized units in a building with other, this isn't citywide, this is just
Correct.
for those buildings, got it?
Yes.
But you have 15% down in monthly income. For,
So we have 15% down, so
Well,
you're on 9, right? So the
Right.
non-residential income is 15% down. So I think a good way to think about this is our retail vacancy and retail storefronts, right? Like for those buildings that have a ground floor store, those
right,
rents
this
have
is
not.
rent only in a, this is residential only.
So
versus
you
all
have
income.
non-residential income is that bottom orange.
Yeah.
If you're moving up, right?
Oh, it's
the-
not, I'm sorry, it's not residential, as opposed to the regulated, which is up 7%.
Yeah,
So rent is up between
2019 and 2024,
2024 by 7%.
which I would say roughly tracks with
A little
RGB.
less than the RGB increases during that period, but not too far up.
Correct.
And cost, you have a chart on expenses,
Yes.
but you have it not total, you have it by, you have it by total.
Yeah, we have it
Where's your
broken out by
expense chart?
pre and post and,
Yeah. Sorry.
it's okay.
You have change in monthly expenses, but you don't have the gross expenses over that period. Because the outcome will be NOI
Yeah.
between those two charts, but, okay. I'm trying to figure out how this relates a little bit to the data that Joe presents, and how it's consistent with or inconsistent with.
So I would consider ours a snapshot of what is happening in 2024 based
Right.
on the people who are filing tax challenges because they're already saying self-selecting in a lot of ways, like, hey, DOF, you got your assessment wrong because you didn't accurately look at our expense and income. That is a subset of what's going to happen in 2024, all of which the RGB will have access to next year. My understanding, and Joe should feel free to come back and jump in, he was taking information from the full year of 2023, and
2023,
which you
got
have
it.
available
Got
today.
it.
Correct.
Got it. And this is a sort of a selected universe of those buildings that are making a tax challenge because they're challenging their assessments.
Correct.
So likely to be buildings that are saying, my income is lower than you otherwise expected, or my expenses were higher than you otherwise expected.
In most cases, both of those situations,
Right,
yeah.
right. So not necessarily a representative sample of the entire stock.
That is where I think, look, we feel it's representative in the sense of it certainly seems to be affirmed every year by what you do, and considering there's a lag, maybe in some ways we're the canary in the coal mine, since what we said last year you were able to show this year, or what we said 2 years ago you were able to show last year on the RGB staff report. So
Does that sound about right, Andrew? That this is a predictor of what we might see
I'd
next
have
year?
I'd have to go back and take a look.
Okay.
I'm thinking along the same lines. I think I appreciate that this is more current than the income and expense report, but it's a smaller sample and it has a different selection basis. But I'm wondering if you could just compare side by side, like this year's income and expense report findings with your previous report for 22 to 23 to see how they compare, and that may give us some sense of.
we would be happy to show that side by side and
doing
submit that
this
as
for 3 years?
supplemental. So this is our 4th year doing
Fourth.
this. We can go back and do a side by side, matching up the years, even though it'll be different year proceedings, if that
Yeah,
makes
so give us
sense.
a ballpark sense.
We are happy to do that.
I have to leave, by the way, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Good luck.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm still looking at the data myself.
Thanks. Thanks for the all the graphs. So I was curious about the heterogeneity because that's been a key topic of discussion. Joe talked about it as well in his presentation. So we had this whole discussion about how many buildings do we think are negative and negative NOI. So so we benchmark that around 11% with some additional set of units that are kind of low NOI. i.e. not much above expenses. I'm curious what your reports indicate on the distribution of like NOI.
So when it comes to NOI, I would say that our data seems to be tracking what the RGB is reporting in terms of there's a bifurcation between what's happening in the pre-1973 buildings, which we posit are most likely predominantly rent stabilized. They are most likely less likely to have access to market rate units. We think that's both a function of the development history of the city. Those tend to be the smaller buildings. They're outside core Manhattan. Number of other factors involved there, but that's, I would say our working position. Versus the NOI health of what's happening in core Manhattan, where again, we think there are newer buildings in the sense of like they're not all from the early 1900s, and they're also more likely to have access to market rate rents. I think that's something that's been well documented by this board as well in terms of buildings that had units that were stabilized and exit stabilization, also a function again of the prior reiterations of programs like 421A, where units were required to be stabilized only for the duration of the tax benefit and then exited stabilization as well.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to ask Alex here about we've seen the collapse in MCIs, and I feel like that's relatively disturbing. It's like we, generally want the buildings to be fixed up, and I just was wondering just what's going on there. I initially thought maybe it was the new J51 because you can't claim both, but J51R hasn't taken effect until I think the papers came out very recently.
Yesterday, yes.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, rulemaking has just started. And by the way, they also said you needed to file by April 30th, so this month, in a few days, if you had started your work before 2024. I always love when agencies give you 24-hour notice or 48-hour notice, as it were, for applications. If you also want to look at HPD's website, you can see for various other preservation programs like 421A-17, they still have their COVID emergency notice and say project managers are not available to meet in person. So when we talk about the accessibility of the various programs that should exist to help owners pay for significant capital improvements, and Joe was right to look at the DHCR MCI schedule and the reasonable life schedule as a starting point for what those costs should be. These programs either are not available, there's insufficient staff resources to administer them, we don't even have the rules yet or the application materials, or the city doesn't have the funds to actually run the various discretionary programs.
So right, I agree that J51 is has been.
So put that one aside.
But I'm like, we have more buildings in distress than ever before, and we have lower MCIs than ever before, and I'm like,
that is your answer.
That's why I'm shrugging. Yeah, that's. Yeah.
No, right. We have lower MCIs because of the changes made in 2019. So this is both a function of the changes in the amortization schedule. I would say the ability to get one. And this also gets back to your question, multiple members' questions about cap rates and capital expenses and debt service coverage. Fundamentally, the bank is not going to loan to you to do something if you can't pay them back. And based on the changes to the amortization schedule under the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, they moved around a lot of numbers without consideration for, again, don't have to listen to us, don't have to listen to any of the industry groups. You could have looked at the Congressional Service Record for what acceptable amounts are. You could have gone to the Banking Association. They made an amortization schedule that makes it so you can't pay back the bank for doing the MCI in the first place. So it's not surprising to us that every year when DHCR releases their annual report as required under Part L of the HSTPA, that you see that the MCI numbers statewide are falling off. We are most concerned about the buildings that are 100% or predominantly stabilized. They do not release that data in that granularity. They do not release it to the zip code level. We think that would be very helpful both from a public policy discussion and even to the extent that city resources are finite, being able to target programs appropriately to those who need it most if, again, the structural system, which is meant for the entire system, does not seem to be functioning at a system-wide level.
Yes, of course.
Hi, Andrew.
So just, hey. So Just when you do the longitudinal look, each year is a different set of buildings, or it's the same set of buildings that you're looking at each year?
We, every year we get a couple of different folks, and then we have the same upset folks who are very keen to engage every year. So we are able to track that on the back end. We do anonymize the survey, for lots of reasons. People don't necessarily want their particular information out there. But we are able to track on the back end that, yes, we are getting consistent data from the same universe of buildings generally. We're really pleased that this year we actually got more information. We even got someone from Staten Island. That's new for us. But we were able to get more buildings that are, I would say, smaller in terms of the 11 units or less. And we think that's a testament to the board's receptiveness and willingness to hear us out on the importance of that segment of the market. Again, that's not data that's released by DOF. DOF does not require the RPIE filings for buildings of that size, so this is really one of the best ways for us to get to it. And we have conversations with Furman Center every year about, like, is there a better way for us to structure this? How can we do this better? Absent, again, DHCR releasing the annual registrations on a zip code level and breaking out by quartile what's happening to our buildings.
Just to add to that, I appreciate that I'm reading this as a forcing function for needing better data on this stock.
Yes.
And that's how I'm reading what's being presented here. I think I'm challenged by just how unrepresentative it is, and that I cannot really read much more into it beyond the need for better data. I mean, there's 5 buildings in the Bronx represented in this data.
If that is all you take from that, I have done my job for today. I understand everyone has different perspectives coming into those proceedings. We do this work in the spirit of trying to add to the conversation. We clearly need more data in this space on all of these various topics. I would love to get folks who understand debt service coverage better and could talk about the modeling involved so that RGB could do some of its initial modeling. Again, using 1.25, 1.3, like that's a really good place to start based on what you're doing. All of these modeling, though, are going to have certain base assumptions. Are you assuming people took out a loan in 2018 or 2017? Is it a 10-year loan? Is it a 30-year loan? Most likely, again, people are running these as businesses, so it's going to be a 10-year loan, which means they're having more pressure from ballooning payments and higher interest rates. This is the only, unfortunately, because DOF does not provide information in real time, this survey is providing information in real time, and I appreciate the limitations of that.
I think we're good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate your testimony. Who's next? Who's next? Okay. This is the small property owners group. I think there's a couple of you, right? Okay, great. Come on up. Great.
I think
So,
there was one slide.
Anne, Anne, we have, no, I'm just saying Anne. We have Anne Korchak.
Yes.
Valentina Goicha,
Goichai.
and Jan Lee.
Yes,
Welcome.
thank you.
Oh my God, more charts. Getting a headache, sorry. A long day.
Yes.
Change in premium on insurance, oh God, yes.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Interesting on those small buildings.
I just wanted to say thank you for inviting us back here. I've been here for several years, so this year I invited Valentina and Jan to join us. They're both operating housing that's 100% rent stabilized. Valentina in the Bronx. And after I heard the Furman Center testify earlier, in an earlier meeting, I thought that her input would really be invaluable because she is on the front lines, running property that her family owns. And And Jan too, he's been at this for a long time, so I think their voices, it's, good to hear somebody else, so. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Jan.
Oh, Jen, you're, okay.
Let,
for her.
give Brian a minute here to do some technical,
Can you hear me okay?
there we go. Thank you.
Thank you, members of the Rent Guidelines Board, for this opportunity. My name is Jan Lee. I'm a third-generation property owner, a resident, and a community advocate in Manhattan's historic Chinatown. We call it the OG Chinatown, the original Chinatown. Today, I represent many small property owners in New York City. We are the children of immigrants from diverse backgrounds, such as Caribbean, Indian, Puerto Rican, African-American, Albanian, Polish, you name it. Our sector of the housing stock in New York City is very unique in that we are very diverse, and we reflect many times the people who live in our buildings. Like many other property owners, my building was passed down through generations, maintaining deep community roots despite persistent economic and regulatory challenges. And for many owners, their properties represent the sole investment in the American dream, their middle-class retirement fund, their pride, and in many cases, our joy. During COVID-19, we incurred significant additional costs with minimum federal financial assistance. Our commercial tenants, popular Chinatown restaurants, and a beauty salon in my building continue to face reduced hours due to anti-Asian harassment, severely impacting their businesses and our ability to subsidize extremely low residential rents. I should add, in my building, I'm fortunate in that I do have commercial tenants as well as residential. Our commercial tenants have had to close much earlier. A lot of you know Chinatown as an all-night, late-night eating venue, but believe it or not, the last seating is 8:30 in Chinatown nowadays after COVID. So that has extremely affected our commercial tenants, which thereby affects my bottom line as well. One of our commercial tenants has been serving food in my building since 1934. The buildings came into our possession in 1924, so we are coming on 100 years of property management and ownership. It's 2 small tenement buildings. In past crises, our family supported tenants personally in ways that corporate owners would never do. In 9/11, we provided comfort and security during those intense community in fear and lockdown. During the 120-hour blackout during Hurricane Sandy in 2012, we ensured tenants' safety, basic needs, and we remained available 24/7. Throughout COVID-19, which was mentioned earlier, I personally delivered groceries from local food pantries door to door to elderly residents who were afraid to leave their own apartments or to allow unfamiliar faces into our buildings. We are the ones they counted on. Recently, essential facade repairs in my building cost way over 6 figures, funded directly from our rental income because small property owners lack access to institutional credit. Only my personal relationship as a licensed home improvement contractor allowed me to work out manageable payment terms with the contractors that I hired. It was personal connections, community longevity, and trust that carried us through a lot of these extraordinary expenses. Ongoing disruptions to Chinatown, you may have heard, and ongoing jail construction, roadway maintenance, and congestion pricing have reduced foot traffic in my neighborhood, further damaging our financial health. We also face increasing regulatory demands, such as very stringent XRF lead testing, which was mentioned earlier, utility inspections, local law 97 emission standards, and a very slow bureaucratic process with the Department of Buildings. Our financial reality has become unsustainable. 5 of the last 6 years resulted in negative net income, most recently a loss exceeding $56,000. Operating costs rose 77% from $485,000 in 2012 to $853,000 in 2023, primarily driven by external factors. Insurance costs increased by 51%. Repairs and maintenance to our building, which I just recently painted my building, and we found that at the top of the cornice of my building, there was a very faint outline, and we redid that outline, and it was, the date of our building is 1870. It requires a tremendous amount of maintenance. So our operating costs, $485,000 to $853,000. Insurance costs, repairs and maintenance went up 229%.
Insurance, as I said, rose from about $25,000 to $36,000, an increase of 51%. Water and sewer rose from $46,000 to $51,000, but spiked dramatically in several other years, 2021 and 2022, at $91,000. Repairs and maintenance, generally $31,000 to $104,000. That was the 229% increase. Payroll and wages, 131%. Our net operating income has drastically deteriorated. These challenges are not isolated, and I know that you are looking for evidence of buildings in distress. Recently, 3 nearby buildings close to my building faced foreclosure sale, including prominent locations like the iconic McDonald's building on the Bowery with its pagoda roofline, the building at the corner of Bowery and Doyers, up for foreclosure sale, and 45 Mott Street, home to the renowned chef Danny Bowen's Mission Chinese and the Instagram famous Basement Bar. Weekly, another family-owned property faces the difficult decision to sell or face foreclosure. When family owners leave, faceless corporations and banks take over, indifferent to our tenants' needs, language barriers, and community crises that they have to be sensitive to. The loss of small property owners threatens not just economic viability, but the very fabric and cultural integrity of communities like Chinatown. Our buildings cannot survive under the current guidelines. Insufficient rent increases directly lead to disinvestment, neglect, and forced sales. I urge this board to approve the maximum allowable rent increases for stabilized leases, enabling small landlords like myself to sustainably support their communities with stability, continuity, and compassion. I look forward to your questions, and like many property owners like myself, once I leave this meeting, I'm going to put on my coveralls, I'm going to lay down a tile floor and pick up a paintbrush and continue the renovation that I stopped to come here to speak with you today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good afternoon.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt for a question real quick? Are you filing for an MCI for your renovation?
So that's a really good, It's a good question, and the deadlines, I know are very strict. The work that we did on the facade repair certainly does qualify. My family's constantly conflicted about what we're going to do with filing for one. I've also talked with other property owners who are unsuccessful in getting the entire amount recovered. It also is such a long period of time to recover that amount of money that I really am a day-to-day at this point. I understand why it's there. I understand that it helps to recover the reimbursements, but it is stretched over decades.
No, I agree. I think like, as a policy matter, it is strange that the state put it upon us we have to create rent increases regardless of the work a landlord is doing on a building, and we shrank the things that pay you for doing things when it seems intuitive that you want to give landlords that do more for their buildings more money.
I will say this.
But that aside, I'm saying if it's a paperwork problem, I'm saying if you're like, I'm doing this work and it's not worth me filing for an MCI, I just want to understand if that's the case and why.
I have to talk to other property owners, honestly, to understand how they've waded through this complex process. Everything that I did was completely legal and permitted, and there's no reason I shouldn't. I understand that. I may pursue it, but I do have to talk to other property owners to see what some of the, why some of them were denied. I do want to say something very quickly about facade repair. Governor Hochul gave Chinatown $20 million to help Chinatown. Among that grant money was facade repair. Right. It's been over a year and a half, and that money's still sitting there. I would like to have benefited from it. This is exactly why she decided to, make these grants available. It's stuck. It's in the quagmire of government that I don't have access to. So that would have been much faster, not forthcoming. Thank you.
I could just add something too about the NCI application process. Like most things, operating in New York is becoming more and more complex, and very often people who used to be able to navigate some of this administrative work on their own are now seeking attorneys oftentimes to help them, because it's just, you need somebody to be able to, answer the questions and make sure you've included everything you need, and that comes at a cost, right? So if you've spent the large amount of money, like Jan is talking about, and you probably don't have the maybe $5,000 you need to retain somebody for a couple of months to help shepherd the application through. And I do know from other owners that they are often, the MCI that's approved is often less than the invoices that, we're submitting. So there's a real disconnect between the actual expense and what's allowable, and you see that on the J51. I know somebody asked that question earlier too. I just got an estimate.
70% of that.
Yeah, right. So the cost schedule often isn't tying into the reality. It's now about $10,000 a floor to put an exterior chimney in, which my family is now facing for a boiler repair, and the J51 schedule is under $5,000 per floor.
And
So it's half.
to add one more issue to the MCI program is that if your building happens to have one C violation, they will not review the application. So if you have an apartment with a C violation and the tenant's not letting you in for whatever reason, you go nowhere. So we had a $500,000 facade project that was done, and the application just sat there waiting for us to be able to clear a C violation going through housing court. And it never happened, and then the application expired because the dates didn't right. So that's back to the quagmire. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Valentina Goichai. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify. I immigrated to the U.S. as a toddler in 1970 with my parents, obviously, and we rooted ourselves in the West Fordham Road area of the Bronx. I'm not born in the Bronx, but raised in the Bronx. And my father was a superintendent when we came to this country, and lost the owner at the time actually lost his building back in the 70s when the Bronx was burning. So it's an interesting time that we're in, right? In the 1990s, we pooled our savings and invested in the areas that we were living in, and we still manage and operate those properties. In the early 2000s, I decided to expand and started to manage property for other small owners like ourselves, and that's what I've been doing to date. That's, got some of those stats there for you. Our portfolio is about 90% rent stabilized. There's some mixed use in there as well. We're not speculators. We are private owners that have provided good quality housing. However, our ability to continue to provide good quality housing has been jeopardized due to the astronomical increase in operating expenses and the uncorrelated increase in rental income. Specifically, real estate taxes, water and sewer, insurance, heat, and compliance with the constant influx of new regulations has really affected us tremendously. These are all areas that we can't control. They're expenses that we can't minimize in any way. I provided a chart of the few properties that are indicative of our full portfolio. And what I did in the chart is I just took our smallest property and went down the line. I didn't really pick and choose in any way. And then I stopped at the 49 unit, thinking that that would be a good, representation of what I see. I looked at 2024 P&Ls for these properties, and as you can see, with the 3 properties highlighted in yellow, they're all underwater. They can't survive. If you look to the right at their arrears, and the first property, which is the 7 unit, he lost $14,000 for 2024. He has about $12,000, $13,000 in rent arrears, and $32,000 lost forever in skipped rent. So his income of $138,000 just can't support the operating expenses. This has no capital expenditures in it. He has no money to place in reserve so that he can address any capital expenditures in the future. I know that City Council is now pushing to have local law applicable to the smaller units.
Right, Local Law 97,
Local law-
right, they've introduced a bill that would include buildings 10,000 square feet and up rather than 25,000, which is the current requirement.
Right, so there's no way that this particular owner would be able to, maintain that. And then you've got the 22 unit, significantly underwater, lost $81,000. There's $186,000 in current rent arrears. This is obviously not 1 year's of rent arrears, it's multiple years that have accumulated going through housing court, and $233,000 in skipped rental loss, where tenants lived in the apartment, received the services, and left with no consequences. You have another 30 unit there. This one I started to manage about a year and a half ago. She's lost $23,000 to date. During COVID, she had severe issues with rental, collecting rents. She has a $350,000 lien from an oil company because she was not able to pay the oil company. During that time, there's no amount of reserve that can possibly help her right now. There's no bank that will finance her based on the rents that she's pulling in. Okay, so rent-stabilized rents cannot support the cost to operate at a bare minimum of service. This is not only unfair to the owners who have invested their life savings into their properties, but it is unfair to the tenants who will not have good quality housing. There seems to be this false narrative that is being fed to tenants that there is no correlation between the cost to run a property and the rental income. Affordability is a personal measure and should be evaluated at that individual level, which is, Genesis, what you noted earlier. We're all for accepting vouchers and expanding the SCREE program and the DREE program. Unfortunately, if a legal rent is only $800, it doesn't afford an owner much. So rental assistance should be provided to those that need it. Tenants should not be made to live in subpar housing because they can't afford the rent. Thank you.
Can I just ask you a question about your data? Very interesting. I mean, this is building level, so it's kind of real. You have 3 buildings. They all happen to have 30 units.
I just went down the line, like I said, about portfolio.
But 2 of them, so just looking at that, 2 of them look like they're okay. One because maybe they have commercial units.
I will let you know.
That spins off additional income.
So the 2,
Like the first one of your 30 units.
the first one
has 3 commercial units and
yeah,
like a
but
higher
I mean,
rent.
you're saying does well. They made $25,000 last year.
Right.
And
So-
then they have to report that on their income taxes.
Sure,
So there's no
sure.
money for reserves.
Understood.
Yes, so I wouldn't consider that doing well, and if you take that
It's doing better than the second building.
well,
They lost money.
part of
right.
it is maybe they didn't have a good management company like,
There you go. There you go.
but.
I'm just
the-
trying to understand more the dynamic and
Well,
what this
the-
sort of says about.
It could, it's just a matter of, it could possibly be that the income for the 30 unit at $1,250, I believe that the legal rents are a little bit higher than the ones, the second 30 unit. So that particular building, we've managed for quite a long time, and when we were able to, prior to 2019, we did renovate apartments.
So you did have some units.
We did, so we got some good increases out of that. We lead exempted them, we put money into the apartments, so the rents are higher.
Right.
If you correlate that to what they're making off of it, the $25,000, and they put hundreds of thousands into updating apartments prior to 2019, I don't know where their return on investment is there. I wouldn't call it significant. I would call it, there is no return on investment. It's a negative.
And that third building, which looks like a higher income,
Yeah, it would be the same situation with that one, but if you
there's
look.
some non-regulated units, or the regulated units are at a higher rent?
No,
because
they're
of-
the higher
'cause-
rent.
'cause
It's
of
also
the
one that,
IAAs.
yeah, it's also one that we've managed for long-term, and a lot of, if you go to the middle building, the second 30 unit,
Uh-huh.
that's not, there's no unit in there let exempt. There were no improvements made to any of the
I see.
apartments. Why, I don't know. I wasn't responsible for it then.
Right.
The other 2, there was significant improvements made to the buildings. And actually, the third one did take advantage of an MCI about, I think it was in 2017. So,
Got it. No, that's helpful, because it gives us a real
yeah, this is reality. Yeah,
picture.
this is
Thank you.
reality. Yeah. So in any of those cases, and again, these weren't picked because this is representative of the full portfolio. These are Bronx properties. These are not wealthy areas. And the tenants are suffering. The tenants are suffering because we can't do more than provide heat and hot water and keep a clean building.
You know,
Ah,
all of these
carpet.
buildings are just like one leak away from disaster, right?
Yeah.
You know, if a pipe breaks up on the top floor and the damage continues, you know, to the floors below, you know.
Yeah.
I got a picture last night, you know, a leak. It's just like everybody's worst nightmare.
And when we talk about the expenses that we have no control over, if you point to the second property, the 8-unit, the real estate tax on that property is $58,000. That's 30% of the total income. So the operating expenses are highly attributable to government charges. This is, you know, things that we can't control. The only thing we can control are the repairs. And you can only put Band-Aids on for so long. So,
Yeah, thank you so much for your testimony. So, 2 questions, but I'll sequence them. So, the first is, given that these are Bronx properties, highly rent stabilized, I'm wondering if you can speak to the testimony we had from Mark Willis, who highlighted this exact segment of the rent stabilized stock and pointed out in particular that there was this risk of deferred maintenance, right? So that the expenses might be declining only because essential maintenance is being put off. So is that something you're seeing? I'm sure you're a great property manager, but, you know, the other...
I can only do so much, right? I mean, I'm a great part, but I'm not a magician. So if there's no money in reserves, how can any of these capital improvements be placed? You know, you mentioned earlier the MCI. How can anyone put in $100,000 or $150,000 or $200,000 into a capital improvement when there's no money? And you're running on a deficit. The owners have eaten up their reserves.
And then I'd like you to help us understand, so for those buildings that are in red,
Right.
you know, what's going to happen to these buildings, right? So they're negative NOI, you know, there's mortgages on some of these properties, so presumably one thing the property owner, you know, should have is some capital reserves and, you know, some operational reserves to maybe go into paying that mortgage. But eventually, then if they can't pay the mortgage, then it goes to foreclosure, et cetera. And what I want to get at, though, is how much of that is a consequence the board needs to factor in as a feature that affects the physical performance of the stock. Because it's one thing if the mortgage holder loses money, it's one thing even if the property owner loses money and turns over. Ultimately, we care about the physical situation of the stock. So how do the negative numbers there for NOI or the financial losses translate to, you know, building maintenance, upkeep, the kind of physical structure of the building?
Well, the priority of payment is utilities, you know, things that'll get shut off. Taxes, otherwise you could put it on a tax lien. Water and sewer. If there's a few properties that we've had to put on a payment plan, I think the interest rates are like 8 or 9%. More? It keeps changing? Yeah. So I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know. I'm doing my best. I'm trying to keep them afloat. I don't know where it's going to go.
Can answer, I mean, this is purely from knowledge of my own situation, but also other property owners in Chinatown. Another friend of mine, a Spony member, like me, is in the trades. A lot of us who are sons of owners went into the trades. Some of that had to do with our survival. Every member of my family since 1924 has had a day job. We have not actually sustained our own income and raised our own families using the building's income. The building, for its entire life, every time that we have felt that we could gain some kind of generational wealth from this, the bar has been moved ahead of us. And so even with independent apartment improvements, at the rate of what the independent apartment improvement reimbursement was at, it's a fraction of what it costs to actually renovate an apartment to recoup that money. So there is no real reality correlation between the amount of money that you're going to put into an apartment and what's available to you. It was originally $15,000, depending on if you had a 400 square foot studio or a 3-bedroom apartment in the Upper West Side. So I think when those metrics catch up, that's when it's going to start to see more housing stock become available on the rental market. I can't quit my day job and live off the income of the building. Neither could my father and neither could my grandfather before that. And so that is our reality. We're at a precipice, as not just my own building. I listed 3 properties in my community in the last 2 years that are on foreclosure sale. We are at a precipice in Chinatown in my community where owners are exactly trying to answer your question. How are we going to, in the red, continue this, this trend? And so we're looking to you for help. I do want to say one more thing about mixed-use buildings. I have the good fortune of having retail space in my building. There are other buildings in Chinatown that don't have any retail space. The burden that I face falls upon my commercial tenants at every lease renewal. And that is an unfortunate thing that I have to have that discussion with them, and they know full well that they're subsidizing the tenants upstairs with their commercial rent. I didn't want to see my tenants leave because they're very valuable to me, because I don't want any downtime in my commercial spaces. Downtime in my commercial spaces means I am further and further toward bankruptcy. So, as I said earlier, I have a restaurant tenant in my building. It's been there since 1934. Do I want to disrupt that relationship? No, absolutely not. There's another small business in my building. I don't want them to leave either, because I think that we have the start of a very good relationship. So Chinatown is at a precipice. We rely very heavily on our retail tenants, but they too are feeling the burden of congestion pricing, getting harder and harder to find distribution with the increase in tariffs. There's many, many things that are putting pressure on our commercial tenants and thereby putting pressure on me. I wish I had the answer to your question.
To add to what Jan was just saying regarding the owners, all of the owners have jobs. That's why they're not managing their own properties. So, yeah, every single one of them. And many of them are dipping into their own personal funds to support the properties. Rent-stabilized owners have been subsidizing these properties for decades, and we get no relief in any way. And that's the issue, and that's why you see the trends that you see.
Did you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have multiple questions, but I wonder, since you are not a social housing provider, and the apartments or the buildings are not generating generational wealth, then what is the incentive for owning this if you are just accumulating debt, right? What's your incentive?
I think you hit on something that's very much at the core of anyone who is Chinese, anyone who's black, anyone who's Native American. There were laws in this country made against ownership of the people who look like me, of my brothers and sisters who are black, who are in other communities. They were forbidden from owning property. This is something that goes much deeper than dollars and cents, and I am at a position as the third owner, possibly the last, to give up what was fought for in 1924 during the Chinese Exclusion Act, during a time when we weren't allowed to enter the country but for a small quota of wealthy people. And so you hit on something that is critical in the discussion of small property owners for people of color, in communities of color. You don't want us to leave the city. You don't want small property owners who are in communities of color to go bankrupt. You don't want New York City to be in the ownership of banks and the government. It's far more expensive for all of these other institutions to manage the properties that I do, because they absolutely will do it in the bureaucracy that we find ourselves in. And it's much more expensive to have CEOs who are nonprofits who earn $400,000, $500,000 to manage the properties that I do. And so I think you've hit on something, and I'm so happy that you've said that, because it goes much deeper than dollars and cents and the pride that we take in the ownership and what we've overcome to own these buildings.
Use NYCHA as the example there.
What is, another question, what is the average time that these apartments, or maybe the whole portfolio, has been in the owner's hands?
So every one of those properties, the owners have owned them for at least 10 years. They're prior to 2019 purchases.
And what about the rest of them?
So,
I mean, your
portfolio.
portfolio.
I don't believe that I have any owner that's acquired anything past 2010
Okay.
right now. I just took on actually one two people that just acquired their properties, and they didn't realize. Usually when you have first-time buyers, they don't understand real estate. You know, they walk in and go, oh, okay, I've got a building now, and I can invest, and I'll have something for my children, and I'm going to build this wealth. And when we sat with both of them the first time, they were in shock, because they didn't realize, what the broker sold them and what reality is.
So you're saying that it was they are over-leveraged buildings?
They're over-leveraged, yeah.
Okay.
Right, a lot of older, ownership, families that have had for generations, typically don't carry debt. And the mortgages were paid off, probably by the first generation or maybe the second generation. And one of you asked earlier, like, where do you see the distress other than the mortgage foreclosures? And I think you gave the perfect example about the gas, right, the oil registered at $350,000.
$350,000, yeah.
Right, so maybe some data is out there, liens against buildings, right? Construction that was not paid, or expenses like that.
Yeah.
And the worst place for any of us to wind up is the lien sale, and we are staring that right in the face. I mean, that is a month away. There are thousands and thousands of buildings on that list that, are small buildings like this, who, have their rent is not keeping up with the expenses, and may have experienced serious COVID rental losses that were never made whole, because URAP, dried up, didn't pay out all the applications, or in housing court. And they may, like I know Christina mentioned that money seems to be a bit more prevalent now, but it just still takes so long, right? That if it's going to take 2.5 years up in the Bronx, these owners can't wait.
Bronx Housing Court, the warrant, once you are allowed to order a warrant, it's backed up 8 months before you actually get an approval to have that warrant issued.
And the HRA process itself is where it used to be 30 to 45 days to get funds paid out. It
Yeah.
could be 2, 3, 4, 5 months. And it goes, a lot of it is due to what you mentioned about MCIs, about filing paperwork. All these agencies are losing paperwork.
Yeah.
I have pro-state litigants who come into court saying, I applied for a one-shot deal 2, 3, 4 times over, and they say they don't have the paperwork.
Yeah.
These are instances where the client's owners just want to get the money.
Yeah. Well, we used to,
Put it that far out.
sorry, we used to be able to work with the tenant directly, give them a rent breakdown. They were able to go to HRA and get a one-shot deal or some type of rental assistance, be put on a voucher. That all changed about 10 years or so, where housing court, it was required, HRA was not allowed to process one-shot deals without a tenant being at the eviction state. And so since you're in court, you probably know that. Yeah.
There's an owner sitting here today, observing, who has a housing court case that's 8 years.
Yeah. Oh, I have some from 2017. Yeah.
I thought it's only 7.
In old church.
I think it's also important to mention that one of the reasons that was changed is because it was a high rate of fraud reported from owners.
No, that's not correct. That's
Oh.
not correct. That's a complete inaccuracy. That was during the time when the FEPS program, I'm sorry, Fixed Advantage program was initiated by Bloomberg. And the program went bankrupt. So when the program went bankrupt, the owners were basically held as unpaid shelters.
That's one of the variables.
It was 90% of the problem. I lived it. So that's what the issue was. It wasn't, I'm sure there's fraud. I'm a certified fraud examiner. I'm very well versed in fraud. I'm sure there was some fraud, but that's not why at all.
Were you not talking about the MCI issue, or were you talking about?
No, I was just talking.
No,
she
she's talking
mentioned
about housing court.
The one-shot deal.
The housing, the change in policy in
Being
housing
able to,
court.
right.
Yeah.
To apply for.
Right, 3 years before having to go to housing court.
It backlogged housing court. It's legal aid is out there. They push for every excuse to continue to, drag on these cases when all it is, as you said, it's a non-payment. It's all about non-payment. Pay your rent. Everybody could live peacefully and move on, instead of making it such an adversarial relationship with the tenant that in the past you had a good relationship with. Now, you're dragging them to housing court, and it's demeaning.
Yeah, I
For
have
the
one-
tenant, it's demeaning, yeah.
I have one last question. I am wondering, what is the average time that any of these owners in your portfolio does a major capital improvement? Because you mentioned, one of you mentioned doing a
So.
facade improvement for $500,000. That doesn't justify this portfolio. Like,
So
why?
The
why
49 unit, the 49 unit is the one that had the $500,000 facade project that we could not process the MCI on.
Yeah, there's
Because
a
of
cap.
one C violation. No, they just didn't accept the application because it had a C violation. They could have put a cap, I mean, would have been happy to accept something.
Yeah.
But they didn't even review the application because there's a C. That's the first thing they do is look at HPD.
Yeah, well, that has been the law for some time now.
No, yeah, I'm not saying it's a new law. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
probably in 2017, so yeah.
Yeah, I'm also like, I don't know. I think the new caps after 2019 basically justify any major capital improvement for, let's say, a boiler, right? The cost of a boiler. But you can apply for an MCI and you're gonna get a just amount back, even if it takes some time, right, to get that money back. It's
So let me ask you
justifiable.
something. Would you invest $250,000 in a new boiler and it's going to take you 50 years to get your money back?
Possible, depending on the
You
size
would?
of your
I
building.
don't think you would.
It depends on the size of your building, right?
Yeah, I don't-
Depends on the size of your building.
But even in small buildings, capital projects really add up quickly. I have a 10-unit building, we have to replace a boiler, and the invoice or the proposal from the plumber to purchase it and install it is close to $70,000. We're told that the chimney is not sufficient. I talked about that big expense, so we'd be talking maybe another $60,000.
Yeah.
And then you have the soft costs. I need to hire an engineer. The DOB has permitting fees, and then the gangster fee I have to pay to an expediter to use,
Right.
you know, a city agency that my tax dollars are supposed to be running. And probably an environmental inspection to make sure there's no asbestos anywhere in the basement, additional electric, you know, to power it properly. It adds up really.
No, it
You
adds
already
up, but
have this.
it adds up because the building has had no improvement in over 10 years, very
No,
likely.
no, that's-
When was the last time you bought a boiler?
Well, a boiler, the boiler's been in there a long time. It's a
Yeah.
workhorse. You know, the plumber doesn't want to remove it.
Yeah, because it's too old. So in 20 years, most likely you haven't changed the boiler. So
Yeah,
of
but
course,
for-
you're going to have to spend a lot of money.
Yeah,
It
but for-
doesn't justify the MCI. There's no incentive to apply for
It
it.
does, but if the rents are capped and you're not able to raise rents to cover operating expenses and capital expenses, it's a problem.
Of course. It's math.
I think also, it can't be ignored that during COVID, we all saw the rise in materials costs. I'm in the industry where we don't know tomorrow what a sheet of sheetrock is going to cost, or whether the labor rates are going to add a surcharge because of congestion pricing and fuel surcharges. All of these things are taken into consideration with us property owners, because I think one thing that property owners may do, they may not be, some of us are not college educated, but we can split a penny and know whether or not we can afford to do what you ask, an entire boiler maintenance plan or a replacement. Looking into a 40-year, 4-decade window, in the scope of what is in front of our face right now, is really daunting. And to understand that we can raise rents according to an MCI or an IAI, the metrics don't work out because they've just not taken into account the fact that the Department of Buildings right now is way backlogged, just like the court system. And so some of these things, even though you would like to get these things done in a month, it's not possible. And that sets us back at a loss trying to constantly catch up. So I think in combination with cost increase but in labor and also surcharges that we have no control over, and also the cost of materials in our trades has gone up exponentially. And so until we can get the DOB to talk to you guys, to find a way to get them on track, you know, just a few years ago, they went to an all-electronic system. That screwed up, and talk to any architect, that screwed up so much of the permitting and the violation clearing and even plan examination. So all of these things are related to what we have to do as building owners to provide safe housing.
Did you have a last question, Alex?
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask about insurance. My co-op also got two 20% renewals in a year, so I understand that. I remember hearing that the affordable industry was starting a captive insurer because they felt that like they were looking at their claims history and being like, oh yeah, like this makes sense. We're going to start our own captive.
There's a small one that's been
Like,
started, yes.
and so I was just curious if like, was that a unique problem in the affordability space where like the insurers weren't underwriting that properly, or like,
sure
are you guys looking at a captive, or I'm curious if like,
Yeah, that's like so far beyond our, pay grade, we're all volunteers. I mean, I have her, actually, Senator Kavanaugh mentioned a captive that was not affordable housing, it was another group. I don't know much about it, but we did share, a recent survey that we did, with insurance with our own members. The increases are astronomical, especially for those like kind of, what we, the 6 to 8 or 6 to 12 unit buildings. But where we see the biggest increase is the umbrella liability.
Yeah.
It was in the survey, because we broke it out, because a lot of smaller buildings just take the liability that's in the commercial package, and the bigger buildings are buying that umbrella. It was triple-digit increases. I mean, it was 300% that the people that responded to the survey saw. So, I mean, that's really not sustainable. And then I can share with you, too, that we had the same carrier for 7 years. Back in October, we were told that they would not renew our coverage. It took until the day before our policy was expiring for the broker to get back to me. And we were given a 3-year policy, which I don't think we had ever been offered. I was very surprised to see that. But the caveat, was that I had to pay all 3 years at once. It was, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you can't afford it, like Val said, you have to finance it.
You have to finance it, yeah.
And the interest rate is very high.
Anywhere from
So
12 to
what-
15%.
To pay that bill in November, because I had my tax bill coming up too, I had to put a contractor on hold, somebody who does a lot of work for us, a really good guy who, we had to do a lot of work in the front to make room for the new big trash cans. And, he waited 60 days for me to pay him because I had to pay that insurance bill. And that goes to what Jan said before too, so much of our survival is based on the generational relationships that we have with a lot of our service providers.
Yeah. The 49 unit that's there, in 2023, the insurance was $35,000. In 24, it was $48,000. In 25, this year, $83,000. Okay. Co-ops, I do manage some co-ops. I have a co-op who was now at 130,000, 62 unit. Last year it was at 93 or 4,000. The year before it was at 52,000.
I think you had a question,
Yeah,
Andrew?
I don't
Close
know,
this out.
maybe I'm the last one.
Yeah.
So each one of the buildings here are carrying a mortgage. Do you know if they're anticipating refinancing at the end of that mortgage, or will that be that they're going to own the building outright and there'll be no mortgage on that?
No, every single one of these properties have a balloon mortgage. So commercial mortgages usually have a certain amortization rate, either 25 or 30, but they'll balloon in a certain amount of time. None of these owners have $1 or $2 or $3 million to cover a mortgage and pay it out. Some of the buildings are resetting in 2026, so they were lucky, and when they refinanced in, I guess, 2020, it was about 3%. They're going to go up to 6.5% to 7%.
Sure.
Okay. I mean, I can't predict next year, but that's based on what's happening now.
Who can?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, for your
Thank you.
testimony.
Thank you.
And for the great work you do. So thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Concludes our public testimony for today. Any additional thoughts, questions, or business for the board? Hearing none?
Sorry to keep you in.
Andrew.
So I will send out an email explaining Wednesday, instructions on how to get there, directions.
Great.
Timing. Do you have any questions? Please ask.
We'll be talking.
Yeah, so if you need anything, but I will send either tomorrow or Monday with all that information.
Perfect, thank you. All right, with that, for a motion to adjourn? We're adjourned, thank you.